Cat claws are totally fascinating because of this wonderful mechanism for keeping them sharp. There's a couple of different ways they keep them sharp, and one is the ability to retract them. So unless they became bipedal and hopped around on their back feet, their front feet are always going to be hitting the ground. And if you've got a claw stuck out, it's always going to be scraping the ground and get blunt, which is exactly what happens in dog claws. And dogs, the canines generally don't tend to use their claws much in hunting. They're more getting grip on the ground while they're running. Whereas the cats have these wonderful, basically scythes, very sharp things that they can use to A, grip, and B, rip out various, they've got them under here that rip out the throat. And to keep them sharp, there's two basic parts to the mechanism. One is being able to retract it. And what they do is this terminal phalanx, the end of the finger, they've got it so ours will go down to some extent. Theirs, they can flip this right up out of the way, and it pulls the claw up off the ground. And the other is in the claws themselves. The claws are basically stacked like a stack of cups. So imagine, standard drink cups with a slight V shape. You can stack them many high. What the cat does, it stacks V-shaped things high, but then puts the bend in them to get the claw. But do you have a cat? No. Okay. Cats always need scratching posts, and they're not just scratching for fun, because what they're doing is, as the terminal, the last V-shaped thing in this claw gets blunt, they scratch and it comes off, and it's like one of those utility knives where you use the blade until it's blunt, then you snap off the blunt bit and press out the next sharp bit. Exact analogy of what's going on in a cat claw. They use the bit that's exposed until it's no longer sharp, scratch it off, and this V-shaped thing pops off, and there's another razor sharp point underneath waiting to rip somebody's neck out. Really clever mechanism. And dogs, because they generally, one of the reasons that dogs gets back to faces, long faces, is because they use their faces more, and this is their grasping organ. They don't use their arms and feet so much for grasping. They just use the fact they've got a long face. Whereas the cats divide the duties. They say, okay, the hands are going to be the grasping organ, the face is going to be the biting organ that eventually kills the animal and rips it apart. Dogs do it all with the face. And so cats have this wonderful claw mechanism that the dogs don't. And it's simply a modification to exactly the same structures that we have at the end of our finger. But they've just made the nail, they've modified the nail extensively, and they've modified the tendons that go to that joint so they can control that joint without moving anything else in the finger. It's really cool. Does that make sense? And
yeah, I think so.
Think of a horse's hoof. The horse's hoof is actually a nail, but it's wrapped totally around the toe bone at the end. So the toe bone is embedded right inside the hoof. Cats do something similar. They have this wrap-around nail, but they also bring it to a point.
I think this might be a cool segue into the convergent evolution, because especially with the hooves, I think I saw that hooves have evolved separately several times. And I imagine claws too have evolved, as different animals come to fill these positions in the food chain, and they sort of develop new tools. Yeah. Claws tend to be a good tool to develop, and I think hooves as well, that these keep coming up in evolution, at least in some similar form.
Yeah, for sure. Right? And within the carnivores, there's lots of repetition. And one of them, I'm going to segue from claws to teeth, because teeth tend to preserve and claws don't. But saber-toothed cats, the ones I mean, with the really long canines. In museums, they're really popular because they look quite fearsome. They've got sort of 6 to 8 inch long canines, and they look very cumbersome. And we don't have any around now, which is good because they'd be quite fearsome animals. But they've evolved 4 or 5 different times, 4 different times within the feline group, the cat group, to get their own. There's a couple of different subsets they get into themselves, but there's a lady, I think I mentioned Blair Van Valkenburg on the West Coast. She studied these evolutions quite a bit, and it seems within the carnivores there's repetitions. So the saber-tooths in particular, one form arises, goes extinct for whatever reason. A few million years later, another saber-tooth appears. So there's something about being a saber-tooth that is useful for carnivores. And just because of the way evolution works, it's useful for a time, and then it's not. We don't know the reason why. But it keeps coming back. And you see those kinds of iterative things within the carnivores themselves. So there's basically a group that are ultra meat eaters, and dogs and cats, and what are the others? Hyenas, I think, are in that group. And then there's other animals that are genetically related and put in the group carnivora, but they're not the ultra meat eaters. And you've got bears being an obvious example there. But within the carnivores, you see repetitions of different ways to be a meat eater, and the repetitions produce animals that look superficially like each other, even though they're separated by several million years of evolution. So within the carnivore group, the basic patterns keep repeating, and the very obvious one is within the saber-tooths. But within the cats and dogs, you see exactly the same. There's a style of an animal that appears 50 million years ago and then dies out, but another one comes on later with similar features, different origins. It's definitely a different animal, but the way its head is shaped and the style of its teeth mimic what's going on here, even if they're not particularly closely related. And so we come round to our present day dogs and cats, and they're the nth iteration in a repetitive process. In a few million years' time, dogs and cats as we know it won't exist, but there'll be some other carnivore that fills that niche, or those niches that they occupy. And carnivores, as a small c carnivores, animals that have a meat or largely animal-based diet, there seems to be only a relatively small number of ways to do that. And so as individual animals of one particular type die out, that's a natural consequence of evolution, another one comes along that does much the same thing and ends up looking much the same way. So the bottom line is, it seems there's a finite number of ways you can be a carnivore. If you're going to be a carnivore, you immediately fall into this set of constraints that you've got to follow to be effective.
I see. A cool example I saw of that is the Tasmanian tiger or Tasmanian wolf. Right. It's not a cat or a dog. It's a marsupial, and it adopted the features to look like this apex predator now.
Absolutely. And it was is an apex predator, but very different evolutionary origins. Yeah. It's not closely related to cats or dogs at all. And I think that was on the sheet I gave you, where it's just showing you the power of convergence. If you're going to, as an animal, if you're going to become an apex predator, there's only and you've got the constraints of having the head at the front and the backbone and the arms at the side. If you're a vertebrate that's going to be on land and become an apex predator, then there's a whole number of evolutionary constraints that make you look similar to all the other apex predators, because there's only a certain number of ways you can do that.
This is a bit different than what we're talking about, but I've heard that basically crab shapes or crab features have evolved many, many times over through the course of history.
Because if you're in the water living on sand, there's only a number of ways to do that, and it's exactly the same principle. If the physical constraints from your environment are similar, then there's only a limited number of ways you can succeed as an animal in that environment. And that's why crab-like forms have evolved many times. One of my favorite is the horseshoe crab. Do you know those? The big carapace on the back that when you lift it up, it looks like the shape of a horseshoe underneath. And underneath this big carapace, there's a perfectly good crab. Not closely related to any of the other crabs we have around now, but I forget how far they go back. Many hundreds of millions of years. And they've been around essentially unchanged for a long, long time. So they've obviously found an environment that doesn't have much pressure on them anymore, and they just continue doing what they do. until we remove all the mangroves, and then they'll disappear.